after 25 years, God has answered our prayers and blessed us with a chance to know her again.
Andrea Michelle Reyes was just 2 years old in 1999 when police say she was kidnapped by her biological mother and taken to Mexico.
It was determined early in the investigation that the government of Mexico did not consider the offense of international parental kidnapping as violation under the mutual legal extradition treaty with the United States.
We have some sense of happiness, but the chapter is not closed yet.
We recognize that this reacquaintance will have challenges. However, we are confident that God is building the path before us and leading our steps.
Imagine spending 25 grueling years searching for your 2-year-old daughter, draining every ounce of your finances, and hope to chase vague clues across international borders. The most shocking part? The police knew exactly who took her and exactly where they were. But a massive international legal roadblock created an impenetrable wall, forcing a helpless father to spend decades knowing his child was living under a stolen identity. This is the unbelievable true story of Andrea Michelle Reyes, and how one tiny DNA sample finally unraveled a 25-year-old secret. What happens when you wake up one day and realize your entire past is a lie? October 1999, New Haven, Connecticut. The air was turning crisp, marking the beginning of the kind of autumn evening where families typically settle into their comforting, quiet routines. Carlos Reyes returned to his apartment after a long day, expecting to be greeted by the familiar, joyful sounds of his 23-month-old daughter, Andrea Michelle. Instead, as he turned the key and opened the door, he was met with a suffocating, terrifying silence. The crib was entirely empty. Her favorite toys sat untouched in the corner of the room. The toddler was simply gone. But here is where this story takes a sharp, incredibly frustrating twist. In most missing child cases, the initial hours are a frantic, chaotic scramble for clues. It is usually a desperate race against the clock for law enforcement to figure out who took the child and why. But this case was entirely different. This situation presented a heartbreaking paradox. The police did not have to launch a massive, blind manhunt for an unknown suspect lurking in the shadows. They knew exactly who had taken little Andrea, and they knew exactly where she was going. Her biological mother, Rosa Tenorio, who explicitly did not have legal custody of the child, had taken the toddler and fled across the international border to Mexico. Carlos had been granted full legal custody by the courts, a protective measure put in place to ensure Andrea's long-term stability and well-being. Rosa was under strict, documented court orders not to take the child out of the state of Connecticut. Yet, in the blink of an eye, the legal framework that was supposed to protect this father and daughter was completely bypassed. Authorities quickly pieced the timeline together, tracing the mother and daughter to Puebla, a massive, bustling city in central Mexico. You would naturally assume that knowing the location and the identity of the kidnapper would guarantee an immediate rescue and a swift reunion. But the reality of international borders is a cold, unyielding machine. I gotta be honest with you, what struck me the most about this entire ordeal was the absolute, crushing helplessness of the father. Imagine being in Carlos's shoes for just a moment. He wasn't completely in the dark. He knew exactly who had stolen his entire world, and he knew the country where they were hiding. But an invisible barrier kept him completely paralyzed. He knew where his child was, but he just couldn't reach her. The agony of having the answers but lacking the power to act is unimaginable. Carlos, however, refused to surrender to that despair. While the official investigation hit major roadblocks, his determination only hardened. He printed thousands of missing posters, staring at his toddler's face as he handed them out. He even traveled to Mexico himself, chasing down every shadow and whisper of a lead, desperately looking for his little girl. Enduring decades of uncertainty, Carlos captured the essence of his relentless fight, stating, "I never stopped believing she was alive. I just didn't know where to find her." When a child vanishes, we are conditioned to believe that discovering their exact location is the ultimate victory. For Carlos Reyes, however, discovering his 23-month-old daughter was in Puebla, Mexico, was merely the beginning of an entirely different kind of nightmare. You see, the police had the suspect. They had the location. They had the motive. But when Carlos desperately pleaded with authorities to cross the border and bring little Andrea home, he slammed face first into an invisible, impenetrable wall: international red tape. To understand how a kidnapped toddler could be left in the hands of a fugitive for a quarter of a century, we have to look at the deeply flawed, complex legal architecture of the late 1990s. At the time, the Mutual Legal Extradition Treaty between the United States and Mexico contained a devastating loophole regarding family disputes. The Mexican government did not legally recognize international parental kidnapping as a severe, extraditable offense. Because Rosa was Andrea's biological mother, the international courts essentially viewed this catastrophic abduction as a severe custody disagreement, rather than a federal crime that warranted cross-border intervention. This bureaucratic technicality created a paralyzing legal shield around Rosa. She hadn't just crossed a geographical border, she had crossed into a jurisdiction that practically granted her immunity. Law enforcement agencies in Connecticut were entirely stripped of their authority the second she landed on foreign soil. Even the FBI, with all its vast resources and global reach, found their hands completely tied by international diplomacy. Reflecting on the sheer frustration of these jurisdictional roadblocks, a retired FBI special agent bluntly stated the agonizing truth of the situation.
Child is kidnapped here in the United States by a parent taken to Mexico. It's very difficult to get that child back. And if the mother remains in Mexico, it would be very difficult to get her into the United States to prosecute her.
It is a reality that completely shatters your faith in the system. A federal felony warrant for custodial interference was eventually issued for Rosa Tenorio, but it came with a sickening catch. It was only valid within the borders of the United States. As long as Rosa stayed in Mexico, that piece of paper was absolutely useless. She could walk freely down the street, enroll her stolen daughter in school, and live a seemingly ordinary life, completely untouched by the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, Carlos was left standing on the other side of an invisible line, armed with full, legal court-ordered custody, yet entirely powerless to enforce it. How would you feel if the law, which is supposed to protect you, is the exact thing keeping you away from your child? It is an infuriating paradox that makes your blood boil. The justice system, designed to uphold order and protect the innocent, became the very mechanism that allowed a kidnapper to succeed. For Carlos, the days slowly turned into weeks. The weeks agonizingly bled into years, and eventually, a quarter of a century slipped away. The investigation files grew thick with dust, inevitably labeled as a cold case. But while the legal system froze, time did not. Across the border, Andrea was growing up, stepping into a life built entirely on a foundation of hidden truths, completely oblivious to the desperate father waiting for her just a few thousand miles away. Little did she know, the life she thought was perfectly normal was actually a stolen reality. While Carlos was trapped in an agonizing bureaucratic nightmare in Connecticut, a completely different reality was unfolding over 2,000 miles away in Puebla, Mexico. To the neighbors and teachers in her community, the little girl growing up in their neighborhood was just an ordinary, quiet child. She learned to ride a bike, spoke fluent Spanish, and went to school like everyone else. But the life she was living was a carefully constructed mirage. She was growing up under a completely fabricated identity, completely unaware that her real name was Andrea Michelle Reyes. Rosa had essentially erased the first 2 years of the toddler's existence. You might wonder how a fugitive could live so openly, raising a kidnapped child without constantly looking over her shoulder for the police. It all came back to that maddening legal loophole that paralyzed authorities back home. As officials later explained,
Determined early in the investigation that the government of Mexico did not consider the offense of international parental kidnapping as violation under the Mutual Legal Extradition Treaty with the United States. And federal charges or extradition from Mexico would be unsuccessful.
because of that single diplomatic technicality, Rosa was practically untouchable. She didn't have to hide in the shadows. Instead, she hid her daughter in plain sight. But maintaining a lie of that magnitude requires an exhausting amount of control. As Andrea grew older, the subtle cracks in her fabricated reality slowly began to show. Rosa was extraordinarily strict and highly secretive. She rarely allowed her daughter to socialize with outsiders, kept her isolated from extended family, and heavily restricted her movements. Whenever Andrea asked innocent, everyday questions about her early childhood, Rosa's answers were always vague, nervous, and constantly changing. There were no family albums in their home. When Andrea asked why there wasn't a single baby picture of her anywhere, Rosa simply brushed it off, claiming they had moved around too much and everything had been lost. Imagine growing up with a massive, unexplainable void where your earliest memories should be. But the psychological weight of this stolen life didn't stop at missing photographs. The real turning point came when Andrea reached her 20s. When she tried to apply for university and formalize her adult life, she hit a wall of bizarre inconsistencies. Her legal documents simply didn't make sense. She couldn't find a proper, original birth certificate, and the paperwork Rosa provided was a confusing mess of conflicting information. Nothing added up. The dates, the locations, the official stamps, they all felt slightly out of sync, like a puzzle where the pieces were forcefully jammed together from completely different boxes. Drop your take in the comments. How would you react if one day you discovered your birth certificates didn't match up? Despite these glaring red flags, Andrea tried to carry on. She got a job and lived a life that felt somewhat normal on the surface, yet fundamentally disconnected from her own history. She had absolutely no idea that the woman who kissed her forehead goodnight was actually the person who stole her. And little did she know, the missing pieces of her identity weren't lost in Mexico. They were locked inside a cold case file back in Connecticut, waiting for a scientific miracle to finally bring the horrifying truth to light. For 25 agonizing years, the case file of Andrea Michelle Reyes sat quietly in the archives of the New Haven Police Department. The edges of the missing posters had curled, and the ink on the original 1,999 reports had slowly started to fade. It seemed like the international border wall of bureaucracy had permanently buried the truth. But in the world of unsolved mysteries, time is a double-edged sword. While it allows trails to go cold, it also allows technology to catch up in ways no one could have ever predicted. The monumental turning point finally arrived in 2024. A young, relentless investigator named Detective Keelan Nickow joined the department and pulled Andrea's dusty file from the shelves. She refused to simply accept the diplomatic roadblocks that had paralyzed previous investigators. Nickow knew that the landscape of investigation had drastically changed since the late 90s. She didn't just rely on standard, old-school police work. She launched a massive digital pursuit. Combining fresh interviews and new search warrants, Nickow meticulously scoured social media platforms, hunting for the tiniest digital footprint that might lead to Puebla, Mexico. But digital sleuthing alone wasn't enough to pierce through a carefully fabricated identity. The ultimate key to unlocking this quarter-century-old mystery lay hidden in the very code of human life. Years prior, Carlos Reyes had provided a DNA sample to a national database, holding on to the microscopic hope that it might one day find his daughter. For a long time, that sample was just a silent beacon floating in a vast sea of data. That all changed, thanks to a groundbreaking initiative known as Project 525, spearheaded by Othram, a highly specialized forensic genealogy laboratory based in Texas. They took Carlos's genetic profile and applied advanced genetic genealogy, actively searching the web for any relative, no matter how distant. What happened next is truly the stuff of movies. Thousands of miles away in Mexico, Andrea, now a 27-year-old woman, plagued by the bizarre inconsistencies of her childhood documents and harboring a deep curiosity about her roots, decided to take a commercial DNA test to explore her ancestry. She was simply looking for her heritage. She had absolutely no idea she was about to detonate a 25-year-old secret. When her results hit the database, the system immediately lit up. It wasn't a distant cousin or a vague familial link. The genetic code was a staggering, undeniable 99.999% match. The code in the blood had completely bypassed the international borders and legal red tape that even the FBI couldn't cross.
What we do, this is exactly why this lab was built. The owners of the company are incredibly passionate. If you ever hear them speak about it, it's empowering, and getting a result like this today is a good moment.
Monumental breakthrough that finally shattered the cold case. A representative from Othram proudly stated, "This is what we do. This is exactly why this lab was built. Getting a result like this today is a good moment." I gotta be honest with you, it gives me absolute chills to think about how this unfolded. A father's unending love and a daughter's innocent curiosity reached out through a simple drop of saliva, finding each other across a massive international divide. Science succeeded where the justice system had completely failed. But finding her DNA profile was only the beginning of an entirely new emotional storm. Now, investigators had to orchestrate a way to reach out to a woman in a foreign country and tell her that everything she knew was a lie. Before we dive into that heart-stopping confrontation, if you are as invested in this incredible journey as I am, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support allows me to keep digging into these forgotten stories and bringing them back to the light. Now, let's get back to the moment the illusion completely shattered. Little did Andrea know, the next phone call she received would rewrite her entire existence. The DNA match from Project 525 was an absolute scientific triumph, but science cannot prepare a person for the emotional wreckage of the truth. Confirming the identity of Andrea Michelle Reyes was only half the battle. The investigators now faced an incredibly delicate and unprecedented task. They had to reach out to a 27-year-old woman living a quiet, ordinary life in Puebla, Mexico, and tell her that her entire existence was a carefully constructed fabrication. This wasn't a situation where police could simply cross the border, kick down a door, and make a dramatic rescue. It required careful, quiet outreach. Imagine being Andrea for a moment. You are going about your daily routine, working, paying bills, living your life, when you are suddenly contacted by authorities from the United States with a claim that sounds like a bizarre psychological thriller. When detectives finally established a secure line of communication with her, they had to gently dismantle the reality she had known for over 2 decades. They explained the 1,999 cold case. They explained the genetic genealogy results and the undeniable DNA connection to a man named Carlos Reyes in Connecticut. Initially, Andrea was completely paralyzed with disbelief. It was simply too massive to process. Her immediate reaction was one of sheer denial, reportedly feeling that her whole life was a lie. How could she possibly be a missing American child? But then, the investigators presented the undeniable proof. They shared the official 1,999 court documents, showing that her biological father had been granted full legal custody. And then came the ultimate, heartbreaking gut punch. They showed her the missing child flyers. Andrea sat in stunned silence as she looked at a faded poster featuring a 23-month-old toddler. She was staring directly into her own innocent baby eyes. A face she had never seen in any family photo album in Mexico, now printed under the bold, terrifying word, kidnapped. In that single, devastating second, the heavy, invisible walls of the lie came crashing down. Her birth date was fake. Her name was not her own. Her entire childhood narrative was a ghost story. What struck me the most was Andrea's profound confusion and devastation. She had to face the horrifying reality that the woman who raised her, the woman she trusted and loved the most, was the exact same person who had coldly robbed her of her true life. Try to wrap your mind around that level of cognitive dissonance. The woman she called Mom, who made her meals, helped her with homework, and kissed her goodnight, was actually a fugitive hiding her from a father who had spent 25 years crying over an empty crib. Rosa hadn't just stolen a toddler. She had stolen Andrea's fundamental right to her own identity and truth. The betrayal was so deep, so intertwined with a twisted form of maternal care, that it left Andrea emotionally stranded. How do you instantly stop loving the only parent you've ever known, even after finding out they are technically your abductor? The scientific mystery was officially closed. The cold case was finally cracked. The little girl who vanished from New Haven in the fall of 1999 had finally been located. But what no one knew was, the reunion process would bring psychological challenges even greater than the search itself. To completely uproot your entire life based on a phone call and a digital DNA match takes an unimaginable amount of courage. Despite the overwhelming evidence presented by the detectives, Andrea needed absolute, irrefutable certainty before she could fully accept the agonizing reality of her situation. She agreed to submit to a second, officially supervised DNA test. The wait for those final results felt like a suffocating eternity, but when the paperwork finally came back, it simply cemented the undeniable truth. The science was absolute. She was Andrea Michelle Reyes, the child who vanished a quarter of a century ago. But with that undeniable truth came an excruciating emotional burden. Andrea now had to stand face to face with Rosa, the woman who had kissed her scraped knees, packed her school lunches, and simultaneously committed the ultimate, unimaginable betrayal. The confrontation between them was not filled with screaming or physical chaos. Instead, it was a heavy, deafening silence, broken by a single, devastating question. Looking into the eyes of the only mother she had ever known, Andrea simply asked, "Why did you take me?" Rosa's justification was rooted in a twisted sense of desperation and a deep fear of the legal system. She tearfully claimed she was terrified of losing her daughter to the custody courts and genuinely believed that fleeing the country was the only way to keep them together. But a parent's love is supposed to be selfless, not a cage built on a mountain of secrets. Andrea was forced to process a horrifying paradox. You can love someone with all your heart and still completely destroy their life. Rosa hadn't protected her. She had actively robbed her of her father, her true identity, and her rightful place in the world. This is where the story takes a deeply complex and emotional turn. Legally, the United States still held an active felony arrest warrant for Rosa's crime. However, because of that infuriating international loophole, the warrant remained enforceable only on American soil. As long as Rosa stayed in Puebla, Mexico, she would likely never see the inside of a courtroom or face legal justice. Andrea essentially held the moral weight of her kidnapper's fate. She could have easily been consumed by a fiery, righteous rage. She could have spent the rest of her life trapped in bitterness over the 25 years that were selfishly stolen from her. But Andrea chose a remarkably different path. She didn't want the immediate satisfaction of revenge. She desperately wanted her truth. She realized that harboring hatred would only keep her chained to the very lie she was trying to escape. What do you guys make of this? Do you think forgiveness in a situation like this is even remotely possible? Instead of focusing on the woman who took her past, Andrea decided to focus entirely on the man who had been relentlessly fighting for her future. In a moment of incredible strength and clarity, she packed a small bag, bought a plane ticket, and prepared to leave Mexico behind. She was finally going back to Connecticut, stepping toward the life that had been paused exactly 25 years ago. Little did she know, the man waiting for her at the airport terminal had been holding his breath since 1999. The flight from Mexico to Connecticut was far more than just a journey across geographical borders. It was a profound passage between two entirely different realities. As the plane's wheels touched down on American soil, Andrea was officially leaving behind a life built on a mirage. She was no longer a fugitive's hidden secret. She was finally coming home. Inside the airport terminal, the atmosphere was completely stripped of the sensationalized media circus you might expect from a high-profile, decades-old, cold case resolution. There were no flashing camera lenses, no aggressive reporters shouting questions, and no chaotic press conferences. Instead, standing quietly near the arrival gates, was a man who had spent exactly half of his life waiting for this exact second. Carlos Reyes was visibly shaking. For 25 agonizing years, he had stood on street corners, handing out faded flyers featuring a toddler's face. Now, he was watching a 27-year-old woman walk toward him. Standing right beside Carlos was his wife, Andrea's stepmother, a woman who embodies the absolute truest definition of family. She hadn't given birth to Andrea, and she had never even met her as a baby. Yet she had unconditionally carried the massive weight of Carlos's grief for over 2 decades. While Rosa, the biological mother, had acted out of selfishness and possession, this stepmother had stood by Carlos through every failed search, every heartbreaking, silent birthday, and every tearful night. When she saw Andrea approach, she wept with a profound, overwhelming joy. It was a beautiful, stark contrast that proved blood alone doesn't make a parent unwavering love and loyalty do. When Carlos and Andrea finally embraced, the heavy, suffocating silence of the last quarter century instantly vanished. There were no perfect words to bridge 25 years of absence, just a desperate, tight hug that finally anchored them both to the truth. But the most incredibly heartbreaking and beautiful moment happened when they arrived at the house. Carlos didn't just welcome Andrea into their living room. He handed her a small, simple key. It was the key to her childhood bedroom. He gently explained that for 25 years, they had never repurposed the space. When Andrea turned the lock and pushed the door open, it was as if time had literally stood still. Inside were the toys she had played with as a toddler, still carefully preserved in their boxes. Resting on a shelf was a meticulously crafted photo album labeled "The Years We Missed." Every single year, Carlos had added letters, thoughts, and hopes for the daughter he refused to believe was gone forever. He had built a silent monument of love, waiting patiently for the day she would finally return to claim it. In the true crime community, we are so often conditioned to believe that closure only happens inside a cold courtroom with the slam of a judge's gavel and the click of handcuffs. But this case fundamentally redefines that expectation. Rosa might still be shielded by an international legal loophole, but true justice here was something far more powerful. Justice was the ultimate revelation of the truth. It was a stolen identity finally being reclaimed, and a broken family realizing they still had time to write a new chapter. Finally, after 25 years of unanswered questions, the family could begin to heal. What do you guys think? Does this ending bring you any sense of relief? Thank you for following this emotional journey.